Hi everybody, I'm working in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Macquarie University. I've been here about 11 years, and before that I used to work internationally with a non-government organisation in Switzerland and work with a lot of the United Nations agreements about how do we live on our planet sustainably. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind trip today, and my talk is Climate Change a Perfect Storm? Unsettling Sustainability. Let's see. So I hope we'll have an encounter today with what are the Sustainable Development Goals. We'll have a look at how climate change can affect those goals. We're going to look at what we might need to do in order to address that climate change, so a low carbon future, what sort of things might need to happen, and then finally a suggestion of steps you could take to address climate change. So let's start with what is sustainability. I guess you've heard about this in your school, and one of the classic ideas is to show a picture of Earth in space. And I think then we get the idea that Earth is a very finite planet. It has fantastic conditions for life. It has an atmosphere, it has water, and that atmosphere regulates the conditions of life. But everything we need for survival is on this planet. So how we use the resources, the nature on this planet, ensures our future survival. But we have to take care of it. As our population grows, we're putting more and more pressure on it. And just like a spaceship, Earth has to deal with the waste that we produce. And that's one of the underlying things about climate change. These are the Sustainable Development Goals that governments agreed to in 2015, and they're supposed to go into operation over the next 15 years in order to achieve more equity in the Earth, more social justice. And I know most kids really want to make the world a better place, and these are fantastic goals that enable us making the world a better place. Now, there's 17 of them there. It's perhaps a bit confusing to try to read all those, so I thought I'd split them up and talk to you a little bit about some different components of them. There's a bunch of them which is about meeting people's needs. So how do we provide for food? How do we provide for good health, clean water, affordable energy, that we give people opportunities to develop themselves through quality education, they have decent work, that we treat both sexes equally, like gender equity, and we try to reduce inequalities in the world, which is very important about treating poverty. So they're around our social development, they're about meeting people's needs. And I left out of there shelter because I've left that in this bunch, which is called shelter, services, stuff and cooperation. Because we also need to think about how do we build our cities in ways that aren't overtaxing the resources of the earth, that create living conditions that are healthy for us, that protect us from the environment when it's very extreme and so forth. We all need shelter, but we need also technology, innovation, infrastructure to deliver services to us, like our electricity, our water, our sewage, our telecommunications and so on. Another part that's very important to think about is then how do we use the resources of the earth to make things in a responsible way that doesn't undermine the ability of the earth to keep on providing for us. And this is a fundamental concern that we have about sustainability. So there's responsible consumption and production. Now, one of the things about sustainability is we've got to work differently than we have in the past. We need cooperation. We need to work in partnerships. So that's using the expertise and brilliance of different groups in society to try to come up with new ways of living on the planet, because our population's growing, our demand on the earth is really overextending the earth's capacity to provide for us. The other thing that's very important is that in this cooperation, we work towards peace and justice, and therefore we have to set up ways in which people can interact and have their voice heard, and we are making fair decisions for people. And of course, there's that climate action, which is going to be our main topic. Now, as I'd mentioned, the earth is providing all our resources, and that comes from life on land, the way that forests, wetlands, ecosystems provide for the sort of cleaning of air, the cleaning of water, the soil fertility, that really provide so much for our basic shelter, food and medical chemicals and so on. There's also life below water. We eat fish and so forth. So also very important to maintain the ability of these natural systems to provide for our resources and needs. And not to mention, of course, our ethical responsibility to care for other life that exists on Earth. So let's have a look at this climate change business and see what's going on. There's weather and there's climate. So weather is what happens day to day. It's sort of like what I decide to put on today is a response to the weather. But the climate is something that goes on over decades or a longer period of time, and it can vary. And when you start to measure, well, what's the patterns of weather over time, then you come to the sense that, hey, something's actually shifted in our patterns of weather, which is our climate, and climate is starting to change. So it's always very variable, but there are certain trends that have been identified, and that is called climate change. So there are around 800 scientists who get together under the UN, the United Nations, in what's called an intergovernmental panel on climate change. And they discuss all the science that's been looked at about our atmosphere, about our oceans, about how nature is responding to our impacts on it. And they put out these very, very measured reports. They are not extreme in any way. And they are saying that there's a 95% certainty that we people, our 7 billion going on for 9 billion, are responsible for global warming, a warming of the climate system. That carbon dioxide is at the highest level ever. We weren't even around 800,000 years ago, but it's higher than that over time. So all the time that humans' agricultural systems have been able to evolve, the carbon dioxide has been much lower in the atmosphere. The sea level is going to rise all around the world at a much faster rate than they thought that it has in the last 40 years. And over the next 2 decades, a lot of the ice in Greenland and Antarctica is going to melt. That's going to put more fresh water in the sea and raise sea levels. So what's going on here is that if you look at the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if you see this orangey graph here underneath the yellow line, that's never been above that level in 650,000 years, around 300 parts per million. So that's saying in a million molecules of air, there's 350 bits of carbon dioxide. So it's fluctuated over this long period of time, but now it's just gone above 300 and it's up to 400 parts per million. Where's it coming from? It's coming from burning coal, from oil, from gas. They're called fossil fuels because they were laid down in a time when there was more carbon in the atmosphere that was trapped by plant and animal bodies and then's been deposited in the earth. We call them fossil because that carbon hasn't been available in the system until we dig it up and burn it, and that puts the carbon dioxide in the air. If you look at the emissions in America, 81% of carbon dioxide is the amount that's causing the warming, but there are other gases, as you can see, like methane and nitrous oxide, which come from agricultural and industrial processes warming the earth. In Australia, most of our emissions are coming from lighting, heating, and transport oil and warming. And then smaller proportions from industry, 15% from agriculture, some of it from waste. As waste is rotting, it releases methane into the atmosphere. And this LULUCF1 is land clearing. That also contributes to releasing carbon into the atmosphere in Australia. Well, how do we know all this? Well, scientists are monitoring the air in 2 very key places, one in Hawaii and one at Point Grim in Tasmania. And these measurements have been vital over a period of time to actually track. You can see here in the green one, the carbon dioxide is going up. All the earlier measures are from evaluating the carbon dioxide in ice. Here you can see methane, it's been rising as well, it's another warming gas, and nitrous oxide coming from industrial and agricultural processes. So there are measuring places around the world, but Australia and Hawaii are very core and key ones. Then if you look at the graph of the carbon dioxide, it's been going up and up. And if you look at the temperatures, you can see that climate varies, but now it's predominantly warming. So it's coming up to a 1 degree average warming around the Earth. The reason this is happening is that these gases, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and some of the halogen ones, are all sitting here and warming the atmosphere. they actually stop the radiated heat. They don't stop the light or energy coming in, but after the Earth is warmed, it's radiating energy, and that is what hits this gas and is absorbed and bounced back down. So it's trapping the heat into the Earth's atmosphere and warming the Earth. So what's going to happen as a result of this? We're 1 degree warmer already. So what we see is that we had a previous climate, which you could sort of map here, but now it's all shifting along this red line here, and so that's meaning we're going to get more extreme hot events. So Australia's climate's warming. This is a graph or a map that's showing where we're getting pretty hot, like 1.5 degree rise in temperature. This is about 1 degree rise, and this is about half a degree rise so far. But that is meaning also that the amount of rain, for example, in April and October that we get in this southeast area has dropped 11%. So that affects our agricultural production, and that starts getting pretty serious. So in regional areas, they're really going to be more affected probably than the cities on the coast. They're going to have the agricultural production affected. For example, grape growing. As it warms, it's not going to be so possible to grow grapes in areas like the Riverina unless we shift to another grape that perhaps can deal with the heat. That's called adaptation. Cattle get heat stress too if they're in very hot conditions. So how we produce our food starts to become an interesting question. And I've put these little bits of these Sustainable Development Goals on some of the slides to point out that if we want to address zero hunger, we are going to have to look at our food production system. If we're also going to want to develop good health and well-being, heat is also a threat to that for humans as well as for other life. So Australia's going to get hotter and drier, and that means we're likely to get more bushfires because the bush all dries out and it becomes incredibly inflammable. And we've had much hotter and more intense fires over the last decade than we had before. So we get bushfires. Look at that. They threaten our sustainable cities, our communities. Houses get burnt down. It can affect clean water and sanitation if your water catchment is burnt and you have silt and so on going into your dam. It can affect good health and well-being because of all the smoke in the air, which causes respiratory problems. It also means people are distressed when they lose their house. And of course, the life on land is burnt out. And so all of this puts pressure on achieving sustainability goals. Plus, you put more carbon into the atmosphere. So that's one of the consequences. And you can see at the bottom all those stock that are being killed in a fire. So fires are going to become more frequent, more intense. So this is all because the planet's warmed. There's been accumulating energy in principally the ocean. So that's why the air doesn't feel that much hotter, but the ocean has warmed and it's been absorbing the heat. So you can see in this spun here, mostly it's in the upper layer of the ocean with some deeper warming. The ice is absorbing energy as well, and it's melting. And you have some absorption into the land, the actual ground's getting warmer, and the air at the bottom is the least warmed of anything. So how do we know all this? Well, those little black dots there on the green map in the ocean are 4,000 floats. Here they are here, floating around in the ocean, measuring the temperature and the salinity of the sea. And they're pumping all their data up into satellites, and you can get real-time measures of temperature and salinity. Why salinity? Because the ice is melting. That's putting more fresh water into the ocean. That changes the density of the water. That changes the currents. So that's important to measure and monitor around the world. So the oceans are warming, and we can see in this map around Australia where they're warming most. But recently we had a big warming event up here in the Barrier Reef, and I'll talk a little bit more about the consequence of that. So the oceans are getting warmer. What effect does that have? Well, off Western Australia, the kelp forests, here they were, growing very merrily over a reef area for about 1,000 kilometres, and then suddenly you got all this high temperature, like a heat wave in the ocean, that you can see on that graph. Look what happened to the kelp forest. It just fell down and virtually disappeared. And then there were 2 more heat events which stopped the kelp coming back. So instead of having these big forests of kelp like this, you now have this seaweedy turf. And that means you lose all the productivity of a kelp forest and all the seafoods that grew in that kelp forest, which undermines the fishing industry, undermines our ability to have food from the ocean. And so life below water is seriously affected by these temperatures. The other big and sad story is the one about the Great Barrier Reef, where a really hot ocean, very much in the north of the reef, was, just made these polyps which make coral shoot out all the algae that normally live with them and make their food. And that meant the coral was starving, and they eventually died, and algae started to settle on them. So you get this scungy-looking reef instead of a beautiful, colourful reef that attracts tourists. So that affects our economy. It means that people won't come to look at the reef because it won't be beautiful, and it also reduces the diversity of life in the sea. Another factor comes to the increasing rainfall events in parts of Australia. Some parts will get wetter, some parts will get drier and hotter. But when you get a lot of rain, you get a lot of runoff as well. And this runoff coming out here into the sea also affects the water quality, because coral likes water crystal clear. And when you get this sediment, it actually affects the health of the reef as well. So we have to keep our catchments, our forests and so forth vegetated, all over the land, so that water can infiltrate and become clean as it runs into our river. So what I'm leaning to is climate change a perfect storm undermining sustainability? And The Perfect Storm was a great movie, which was about a true story where 3 storms all came together and made a superstorm. It's also a metaphor where you could say in the financial crisis, a whole lot of crashes in America and Europe then had an effect on Australia. So is there sort of all these things coming together which could actually undermine our sustainability? Because there's so much energy in the sea, it's warmer. Therefore, as you can see on this side, with a warmer sea, you get more water going up into the atmosphere. So it's running around as a gas. It in itself, water or clouds actually warm the atmosphere as well, but you can get then more rainfall, more floods falling on the earth. But you also get hotter storms. And this was Hurricane Matthew that hit Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the world, and it just whipped through those houses, pulling off roofs, shattering crops, no food, increasing poverty, no work, not a sustainable city or habitation, no clean water, diseases like cholera coming, just absolutely undermining everything about a quality of life for those people. So what we see is that hurricanes are going to increase in intensity. There's more energy in the system, more energy in the ocean, pushing this water up, heating the air. And so we're getting these bigger and more disastrous storms. Like Hurricane Sandy was a bit of a perfect storm where a number of events came together. And what you had there was 8.5 million people lost their infrastructure, no power. 80 homes were lost in one fire from gas leaking out and exploding. 65 billion in damages. When people say to you, it's too expensive to change our energy system in climate change, ask them, well, who's paying all this money for the damage that's coming from our superstorms? So this is in America. This is when Sandy hit. You can see that we have very vulnerable coastlines. It had a beach here, and the storm just blew right through this part here. They've been pushing the sand back, but the sea came right in over the homes, flooded roads, blowing out your infrastructure, costing heaps of money to restore. And of course, it's not much fun to have your house flooded, is it? I mean, destroying your livelihood. So infrastructure goes out with these big storms, electricity goes down, water systems get flooded, and so on. And even the subway in New York got flooded, so people couldn't even get to work. So these things undermine the productivity of countries, the economy of countries, enormously. And of course, the emotional impact as well, which affects our well-being of losing everything. And that can also mean increase of poverty for people, because many people who are poor can't afford to insure their property, and so they lose everything. This is Katrina in 2005, which is on the coast of USA. That's the black area, is the area that was flooded after 1 week after this huge storm came through. And there the damage is $108 billion, right? 2,000 people almost died. 1 million people had to be moved out of that area, out of their homes. They couldn't work. Their families are all disrupted. So it's affecting, again, poverty, and those who are poorest were most affected. So climate change has a pretty inequitable impact also on people who are poorer. So flooding, because New Orleans is very low to the sea, Miami is very low to the sea, they've already got the sea bubbling up through their drains in Miami. So this coastal flooding, which is coming from the melting of ice, as well as the expansion of the sea through the heat, is going to cost billions and billions. And in Australia, we have something like $226 billion of infrastructure that's exposed to 1 metre sea level rise, and that's predicted easily by the end of the century. So huge money is going to cost, and we need to do things. The other thing is that island states say, this is jolly unfair. All you developed countries have been burning fossil fuels and climate change has happened, but we're copying it. Look at our islands. They're so low that over and over the sea is coming in and washing over our islands. It's wrecking our fresh water. It's wrecking our soil. We can't grow our food in it. So they're actually set to migrate. So one of the big factors of climate change is we will have huge numbers of ecological migrants who have to move out of flooded zones. In Bangladesh, there are millions in a delta that will get flooded. There's going to be migration around the world and refugees like we can't even imagine at the present time as these things start to go into play. The other thing is the heat. That actually causes people to die too. And a lot of countries are going to have 50 degrees day after day after day in the Middle East, North Africa, and maybe in Central Australia. And when you have heat day after day after day and you can't cool your body down, then you get heat stress. And in Europe, in 2003, more than 70,000 people died. There's also the risk of mosquitoes, moving their range, having longer biting periods, spreading more diseases. And even when we're hot, we get pretty crappy and we start, being more aggressive. And so being hot is not good either for our social well-being and for interacting with each other. So that's a grim story, but there's a positive story, and that is how do we get back on track for sustainability? It's very critical we act now because we don't want the temperature to go really above 1.5 degrees, but governments have definitely agreed they don't want it to go above 2 degrees temperature rise. But the way we've been living means we're on track for a 4 to 6 degree temperature rise, and that's just hell on earth. So we need urgent action, and we know if we want to keep this temperature below 2 degrees, then all these bits of CO2 you see floating around here, that's about how much CO2 we can afford to put into the atmosphere. We've already put all this much in. We've only got this amount, 60% of the carbon we can put into the atmosphere before we go over into 2 degrees or over 2 degrees. So it's urgent that we act and act fast. So fortunately, last Friday, into law came an international law to stop climate change at 2 degrees. Do you know Australia has not ratified this law yet? It's unbelievable. But many nations have, and they're meeting at the moment in Marrakesh discussing how are they going to pull back our emissions of CO2 so that we try to keep below 1.5 degrees. Number one, what should we do? Cut fossil fuels. Right? We shouldn't be burning them anymore. 88% is like a carbon bomb here. 80% of our coal should not be burnt, should not come out of the ground and be burnt if we want to stay below 2 degrees. So we have to cut burning fossil fuel. That means we have to change our energy system and we have to look for other forms of energy to drive our incredible economies. We can only use that fossil fuel to adapt our systems, that's it. And we need to become very, very rigorous in cutting back. Other forms of energy need to come into play, and these are what the UN goal is saying: let's make affordable and clean energy. Out at Broken Hill, there's a big solar photovoltaic cells capturing the sun's energy. People are putting these on their rooftops, and coming soon, our battery provisions will enable you to store your own energy on your own house. So what we'll find is you can just become your own little powerhouse and have your own energy stored. There's even new systems like just making tiles that are solar panels. There's also solar thermal. This is a big array of mirrors in Nevada. There's another one in Spain that focuses heat on salt, and that melts at 800 degrees centigrade. It costs about $1 billion to put in one of these, but think about how much it's going to cost with the damage of climate change. But that hot salt can heat water all through the night and make steam, which will drive turbines. So that is a very good way of bridging the non-daytime source of energy. Another, of course, is wind energy, and there are others as well, like geothermal and ocean-type energy we can trap. We need to invest much more in thinking about what are the new jobs for the future. They're not going to be in coal mining. They're not going to be in gas and oil. They're going to be in renewable energies. They're going to be much more in coming up with innovative solutions for how we live. This here is a printed solar cell that CSI Rose developed. You could put it on your backpack and it can charge your phone while you're walking along. You can put it on windows and it'll take in energy and so on. So innovative ideas like this one, which is using wants to put solar cells here and then use that solar energy to pump water from this lower old mine site in Kidston up into the top here, and that will then allow the water to run down and turn a turbine, so you've got hydropower. So very innovative ideas and reusing of sites. The other thing is to build our buildings more energy efficient and to create more green spaces in our urban areas. As you can see here, when you have a lot of concrete, you get a lot of heat trapped, and that makes living conditions much hotter for us. The other areas in transport, using much more public transport rather than private forms of transport, because then we keep making roads and then we have more congestion and so on. But of course, electric cars are coming, and electric cars that are charged with solar energy are at least a renewable form of personalised transport. So also active transport, walking, biking, good for your health as well. The other thing is to maintain our natural areas, so life on land. You can see I'm actually coming back to the fact that all of the Sustainable Development Goals actually work to help climate change. So if we keep our forests, they absorb carbon, they're a store of carbon, but they also provide for us in giving us clean water by managing the water flow through a catchment area. They help with soil fertility, plus they keep a diverse array of beautiful wildlife. So getting involved to restore forests so they're very healthy, getting weeds out and so forth, is a very important thing for us to all be contributing to wherever we are. And certainly keeping vegetation on farms is a very, very important part too, because soon it's going to get too dry to even grow it again. Consumption, this is, everything we eat, use, buy. You can see in the graphs here, everything's been going up. The amount of water we use, the number of McDonald's shops that we have, our paper consumption, everything, communication and phones, everything's gone up and up and up since 1950. And all of that depends on us taking stuff out of the earth, making waste, and then the earth having to deal with it. So think about whatever we spend our money on is making a contribution to our future earth. And then we have to get smart, and this is where you'll be really involved, is thinking about when you design something that you're thinking about how can that be recycled back into an industrial process and not wasted. So here is a dairy or a feedlot, for example. You have a whole lot of manure. You think about how can we use that manure, which is sort of a waste. You could make a fertiliser, but you can also put it into a biogas digester, and out of that you get methane. And then you can use that methane to drive, say, an ethanol plant, which might be taking cellulose-type agricultural products and making ethanol for fuel. So we get smart by having closed loop and no waste in the way we design our production. And this group here, Bauer, they actually won the Premier's Prize for the Green Globe Award because they've set up a shop which repurposes old furniture, electrical items, so that nothing is thrown away, but it's loved, you might say, and redeveloped so other people and poor people can use it. And then we might come to zero hunger. How do we feed a growing population on the earth? Do we do it like an Australian family? This is what an Australian family eats in a week. Huge amount of meat, lots of processed food. All of that has more sugar and salt. It's also taking more energy to process that food. All these drinks here are sugar and costing a lot of energy to produce. And over here you see a family in Ecuador where their food is vegetables, grains, pulses, and that's a healthy diet for them. So we need to think about how do we balance our diet somewhat more that is looking at equity around the world in the sharing of food and trying to eat more local food. But definitely there's a lot of question about how much meat costs the earth to produce. That comes to the end of what can we do. There are all these ideas that I put forward, and I'm sure that you can go on and find out that there are a lot of things for all of those 17 goals that contribute back to climate change. But the important thing is that it's not going to happen unless people change what they do. So in your schools, you might be able to come up with programs or action ideas where you get a bright idea, you get together with some others and say, hey, how can we work on this? And let's take some actions and try to bring about change. This might be to stop the effects of climate change, or it might be ways that you can adapt so that your farms or your school or your home is not actually being as badly affected by climate change. So at the end, some would say, but what if it's a hoax? I think increasingly people recognise now that climate change is a very serious affair. But if it was a hoax, what we would have is energy independence, clean energy, less air pollution, less asthma, preserved forests, beautiful green spaces, green jobs, livable cities. Hey, and we might even work together and cooperate to make the world a better place. Thanks for listening. I'm happy to take your questions. Small things that can be just in your home. That's looking at one is now, while we're using fossil fuels, be more efficient with what we use. So, turn off lights, use air conditioning moderately, not to have like heat, in heating and so on. So to try to reduce that energy, often insulating the house, growing trees on the western side are important. The other thing is energy efficient appliances. The fridge is the most expensive energy user in the house, so if you have to renew a fridge, get the most efficient you can. They last a long time and they pay you back in energy. If you can afford it, start getting towards putting solar cells, so you're actually reducing the amount of coal that has to be burnt while we make a transition to new energy. The other thing is the diet, thinking about processed food, all of that. Anything that's processed has had lots of energy in it. It's been trucked back and forward, it's been cooked, it's been refrigerated, it's been dried, it's been manipulated. All this energy has gone into that food, and yet it's not providing as good a nutrition as eating an apple or an orange or a banana, for example. So eating more fresh food, trying to eat more local food, and trying to eat less meat, because cows actually burp methane into the atmosphere, and that is contributing to global warming as well. Plus we also clear forests and woodlands to have grassland for cattle. And we've done enough of that, so we shouldn't be doing any more of it, I don't think. But also that you can do things in your community as well. I mean, if you all took a role in starting to educate your community and helping to stimulate your community to think about, hey, what can we do to become more resilient into the future? I don't think it's a gloomy story. I think it's a story of hope. And I think that it's a matter now of communicating what a low-carbon future is, which is renewable energy, different ways of transport, different ways of eating. But it's not like going back to the cave. We still have a really good life, but we just got to change. And that's the hard bit, is getting people to change. So you can all play a role in talking with people about the importance of us all making a change in what we do. So I don't think it's a bad story if we act now. We've got this critical period to do it. So let's do it. It depends what we do. It depends what governments do now. And governments are only going to act if you, young people, are saying, come on, government, it's important that you act. And I think they're very scared of saying, well, electricity is going to increase in price and therefore they'll become unpopular. But it's something we're going to have to do because of all the costs that we never pay for on electricity. All that damage that happens with fires, with big storms, with floods, we don't pay for that in our electricity at all. That's paid for by the people who get hit by those disasters, and sometimes through some disaster relief as our taxes. But if we actually pay the real cost of coal or oil energy, then it would be dearer than renewable energy. So we need to push our governments to really change our energy system and to start looking at new ways in which we're going to be employed in the future in Australia in green energies and technologies. I think that's an important question that the communities have to sort of work together on to try to solve. I don't know at this stage whether, say, a thermal solar plant would provide enough energy for a steel mill, but obviously it's got to burn coal in order to make steel. So that's maybe where we decide: do we still build with steel? We'll have to build some things with steel, but are we going to change to, say, laminated wood and so on, which would reduce the amount of steel we produce? So we're going to have to think through what sort of materials we're going to create and how much energy is embodied. So the coal is going to steel. I can see that has to still happen, and that's part of what sort of CO2 is going to be emitted from fossil fuel into the future, until we come up with other products. But it's burning the coal for our electricity, our heating and so forth. That's the part we have to sort of really radically change. But I'm not an industrial scientist, so I can't give you an answer on how you transition the steelmaking industry to something more sustainable. I'm sure there's certain ways in which you can do the firing of that steel in more efficient ways than we do, but I don't have the answers fully. But that's why we need partnerships and why we need people to be working in more innovative and research-oriented approaches. And governments need to support that research, and so we need to push them to do that. Yeah, the temperature is sort of set in train now. I mean, we've got a 1 degree warming. The idea is to mitigate, to try to stop the warming growing too fast, so to stop it at 1.5. With the reef, I think areas will recover, but we might find the reef starts to migrate south because the water's too hot up north. It's a matter of keeping the oceans clean of the sediment from our land. That's one thing that contributes, so that we're much better managing our catchments on the land so that we're not throwing a lot of sediment into the sea, which adds a lot of nutrient as well to the ocean and lots of cloudiness. So with the reef, I think there's work going on to try to grow corals on the land and then try to transplant them back if there has been death. So there's lots of work in restoration of ecosystems that's going to go on into the future, and you might like to be a biologist or as such that's actually working on efforts like that. We also need to sort of cut back our consumption of fish so that we're taking only enough that allows those fish to rebreed and repopulate. At the moment we're taking out too much, so that the fish populations tend to be collapsing. So it's all decisions we make as people, and it's a matter of us saying, okay, this is how we're going to do it in the future, and it's all about changing our behaviour. That's the tough one. when you get hot, you get, I think a bit flustered, but that's what the responsible physicians are saying, that actually when you get hot and you get uncomfortable and you get irritated, then if someone says something to you, you might just bop at them instead of dealing with it in a mature way. So, yeah, hot cities mightn't be much fun to live in. Because of the cost, I think that and that means a very radical change in our economic system. You have a coal industry, of course, an oil industry that are actually, putting out information to say climate change isn't really happening. They're lobbying for their own industry because that's where they make profit. They're able to lobby your government, and governments they only make decisions based on how much pressure they're getting. And if the people and the public are saying, we want 100% renewable energy in Australia, and that's the demand, they'll go for it. But they're not going to go for it if it's going to be unpopular. So if they don't hear messages from the people saying, yes, we're prepared to pay for it, we think it's important, let's do it, then they're going to be, trying to go along business as usual because it's nice and comfortable. So we have to make it tough and push and drive for that change. Because there's more carbon dioxide in the air, it's able to dissolve in the ocean. So carbon dioxide and water makes carbonic acid. So that's because of that carbon, that's where a lot of the carbon dioxide is being actually sunk into the ocean. So that's shifted the ocean to slightly more acidic, and that then affects the chemistry in the water. In a more acid environment, it's much harder for animals to make a shell, for example, because they're taking calcium out of the ocean to make their shells. And if you put a tooth, which is calcium, in an acid, a weak carbonic acid like Coca-Cola or carbonic acid, it will start to dissolve. So it makes it harder for any animal that has a shell or a coral to actually make a firm skeleton into the future. Well, one of the things is that we have an identity, we see ourselves as a certain sort of person. If you work in the coal industry, then you're going to think, well, coal's black gold, right? It's important, I love it. And then if you come and say to people, but we can't burn coal anymore, then it affects who they are. And people often don't like to take in new knowledge or new ideas if it sort of conflicts with who they are. And I think that's been a big factor. The other thing is that there's this tension, you might say, between those who want to make money out of the traditional ways of making money out of the earth without paying for the cost of the damage they're doing. They want that to continue, and so they're going to fight for that. And the rest of us who get the effects of the climate change from their actions are paying for it. So it's inequitable, and they're getting rich, and we're getting more and more inequity in the world, with some people getting incredibly rich. And mostly that's probably from exploiting the earth and out of the interests of those of us who aren't actually in that field and game. So addressing inequality is a very important part of sustainability. Anyway, I hope you're going to have a positive thing. Let's think of things that we can do and start to take action, because it's not a lost game. It's a game where government's actually trying to think now, how do we get this in place in politically popular ways? So what you can work towards is making us politically popular to really address this fast. Carbon neutral, no. They're only talking about cutting back, 20, 30, 50% of emissions. Will they become neutral? Probably not, unless there's an immense push from the community to say they need to. That's a hard challenge to do in 15 years, but they need to be working really hard to drive that. So some of the states in Australia are aiming for 50% renewable energy, so that will cut back our emissions by 50% at least. Getting to 100% is going to be tough and more expensive. Pleasure. Here you. If you have any questions, you can send them to me on my email, okay?